What advice would you give someone who's starting to work with an artist estate?
So artist estates are actually sort of a newer phenomenon within the last several decades. Obviously they existed before that, but it's a growing trend that we're seeing based on the wealth of artists these days. I like to say to artists there are a couple of things they need to think about. One is thinking about what is the lens that somebody should take on their legacy? And that means it frees up other people from asking the question, what would the artist do? So for example, with Rauschenberg, you might say Rauschenberg was a risk taker. He was collaborative. He was a creative problem solver. And by virtue of defining those factors, it allows us to create a legacy or a mission statement that can exist in perpetuity. Another key question for an artist is how long they'd like the foundation to exist, whether that's for a period of time or on an ongoing basis, because the strategy really depends on that sort of lens. So starting when you're a living artist is actually quite important.
And what do you think is a successful estate?
Success really can be defined by the artist, I believe. For example, Robert Rauschenberg, risk-taking is one of the elements which defines our lens of his legacy, and how you define success as a risk-taking grantee or resident at our residency is entirely different than if it was around successful metrics. So this is actually quite important. Again, it goes back to defining the legacy. I think that having a long-term view of the legacy is also quite important. This deals with the placement of the art and the sales of the art. So looking on a broad basis of people's understanding, what museums will host this, a long-term exhibition strategy, and especially a long-term sales strategy.
And what could the biggest mistakes be?
The Rauschenberg Foundation actually is an interesting case where you could say that by appointing friends and colleagues as trustees actually became quite expensive. And one of the things I would recommend to artists is to consider both people who knew you, professional allies, and experienced people to be trustees, and to define a cap for those trustee fees, because a percentage of a foundation can be quite expensive if that's the running rate.
Why is an institution such as the Institute for Artist Estates going to be useful?
The Institute for Artist Estates will be useful in a number of ways. Right now, there's only several people who serve this market. There are lawyers, and there are gallerists, and then there are auction houses. The need for additional services for artists is actually quite warranted. People who can help with this strategic planning, but also not every artist needs a foundation. You actually can have a community foundation in the future, and this is something that I forecast would happen in the next 3 to 5 years, my estimation. And with the rise or the instigation of this organization, I think we'll see many more.
And how have you found the conference so far?
We have a conference like this in America, and I was so excited to see 220 people coming to the conference today, which evidences the need and the interest in information sharing like this, but also a community of people who can share stories and best practices. So it's early in the conference, but most of all, I've actually loved to hear the stories from the families closest to the artist, especially because I am more of a business person, and those people are very important and allies in the strategy and the management of a foundation.